Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Another Place, Another Time, Chapter 10, The Last Patrol. It took nearly a week for U-190 and the two boats that traveled with us to move cautiously through the Kattegat and Skagerrak to reach our bases in southern Norway. The Allied navies, which possessed the matchless advantage of being able to intercept and read decoded radio communications between BDU and U-boats at sea, were fully aware of the movements of most German submarines at this time, but owing to the presence of German land-based aircraft, the enemy could not risk surface warships in these shallow waters. The nearer we came to Norway, the more active enemy air patrols became, and not only did aircraft equipped with highly accurate radars search for U-boats at sea, they also mined the approaches to our bases. We became aware of this threat on February 17th of 1945 when our three boats entered the Oslo Fjord near Horten. U-1273, the new Type 7C boat on its first patrol, was traveling behind U-190 when it hit a mine and sank immediately, taking 43 of its 50-man crew with it, including the boat CO, Kapitänleutnant Helmut Knollmann. The sight of this disaster, which was witnessed by our bridge watch, deeply affected us, particularly since we had squeezed ourselves between U-1273 and the preceding boat instead of following U-1273 as we had done before. We were convinced that the mine could have been the counting type, a mine that lets a number of targets go by before exploding at a set number, meaning that U-1273 had been destroyed by a mine meant for U-190. This tragedy, however, did not affect our activities as, after a brief stop at Horten, we continued on to Kristiansand South, from where we would depart on patrol. By this late period in the war, the U-boat Waffe had nearly been swept from the North Atlantic. The attempts of our commander Dönitz over the previous 9 months to hamper the Allied invasion of Europe and the resulting buildup of enemy troops and supplies on the mainland had been frustrated by overwhelming air and sea forces, and we had suffered heavy losses in boats and crews. But U-boat High Command did not give up the struggle, as it was Dönitz's intention to continue fighting with our obsolete Type 7 and Type 9 boats until the new Electro boats entered service, hopefully in the spring of 1945. We were told that the purpose of our mission was to tie up Allied forces by forcing them to disperse and fight us wherever we showed up. It was reckoned that any ship or aircraft occupied in chasing us was one less warship or aircraft that could be used to directly attack Germany. By continuing our operations, we also forced the Allied navies to maintain the very uneconomical, in terms of the warships and personnel it required, convoy system, and this in itself was considered worthy of our best efforts. This attitude was reflected in the words of a flotilla chief who, bidding goodbye to a submarine, was heard to say, "Never mind sinking ships, please, just come back." Thus, the U-boat Waffe went on waging what had by now become a very unequal struggle. Schnorchel-equipped Type 7 boats were sent to the waters around the British Isles, but the larger Type 9 boats, such as U-190 with their greater range, were as usual ordered on long-range missions to distant areas, particularly North America. Between February and April of 1945, 19 U-boats, all Type 9 craft, were sent west across the Atlantic, and 10 were destroyed. Our boat's objective, as we learned when we docked at Kristiansand Süd on February 18, 1945, was to head for the Western Atlantic. We took the opportunity to top up our fuel tanks, and then at 6 p.m. on February 21, 1945, U-190 departed from Kristiansand for what would be its 6th patrol. Our course lay across the North Sea, then north of the Faroe, then through the Faroe-Iceland Gap, and finally southwest into the Atlantic until we reached the area on the German naval grid denominated as CB-23, which lay about 150 miles southeast of Halifax on the Great Circle Route. In all, it took us more than 6 weeks to reach this point because we spent most of our time traveling submerged, using U-190's electric motors, which would only provide an economical speed of 1.5 knots, or in plain words, a crawl. In the first 2 weeks of the patrol, during the time we were on the North Sea and traversing the Faroe-Iceland Gap, we surfaced rarely. After we were well out into the Atlantic, we ran on the surface for longer periods at night, sometimes for as much as 10 hours, but our progress was still not swift as we kept our speed down to conserve fuel. In the Middle Atlantic, Obersteuermann Dombrowski, our navigator, piloted by using radio beams provided by the Kriegsmarine Elektrasonne navigational system, which was very similar to the Allied Lorentz system. Various land stations in Norway, in our bases in France that were still holding out, and even in Lugo in Spain, transmitted radio beams on fixed bearings but different frequencies that created a lattice pattern across the Atlantic. We had a small dipole antenna attached to our schnorchel, and after receiving these beams and identifying them, we could triangulate them to arrive at a rough estimate of our position. When we ran on the surface for longer periods, it gave Dombrowski a chance to shoot the stars. At set times during the day, usually in the evening hours, our radio man listened for messages broadcast from the high command transmitter at Magdeburg, codenamed Goliath, which we could sometimes pick up while running just under the surface. We usually timed our use of the schnorchel to coincide with the scheduled time for us to receive radio messages. From High Command, we learned after leaving Norway that our operational area was to be off Halifax Harbor in Canada. This came as no surprise, as late in 1944 two boats, U-806 and U-1232, had carried out very successful patrols in this area, sinking a number of vessels, including a Canadian warship. The result was that Dönitz, feeling the enemy defenses around Halifax were not quite as vigilant as the other areas of the North Atlantic coast, had dispatched a number of boats, including U-190, to hunt in the entrance to a port that was one of the major mustering points for the North Atlantic convoys. During our crossing of the Atlantic, we had a few encounters with enemy, probably American, surface vessels which pursued us for hours with a tenacity that evoked our admiration, as the rough seas would have sent German destroyers home very quickly. We were fortunate that their depth charges only rattled our nerves and never came close enough to cause any damage. Possibly our worst enemy during this slow and lengthy voyage was boredom. Much has been made of the horrifying conditions U-boat crews had to endure during the war, and certainly it was no picnic, but the reality was not nearly as bad as has been made out because, except for the occasional bursts of action, our life on long patrols such as this was rather tedious. During this seemingly endless voyage, I remember spending countless hours reading books and playing in chess tournaments. We seized on anything that might provide amusement. We held competitions for inventing the most stupid joke, and we developed an interesting social intercourse with a solitary fly that appeared in mid-ocean and which, after fierce debate, was christened Emma. We later speculated about the subsequent miraculous appearance of Emma's daughter. We also engaged in an intense analysis of and debate about the growth of the only other living matter aboard U-190, mildew. Philosophical discussions about anything and everything were geared to compensate for the somewhat stupefying effects of long periods of inactivity in a closed environment 200 feet below the surface, as we were well aware that atrophy of the brain was one of our biggest problems. There were, however, some subjects we never talked about: politics, war aims, or the reason for being out there in the first place. Cooped up in a close confinement for such a long period meant that personal habits, which might under normal conditions have been only a minor annoyance or even a subject of a joke, became unbearably irritating. I remember that one of the strains of my daily life was watching my friend Herbert Rogge, the first watch officer, undertake his very peculiar method of brushing his teeth. After watching this for the 100th time, I developed an unreasonable but ardent desire to murder him, since there was absolutely no practical way to escape his ritual, which became a daily torture for me. If you lie down, you use less oxygen than when you stand up or move, and if you sleep, you use less oxygen than when you are awake. On this long patrol, we tried to sleep as much as 20 hours a day to save oxygen and electricity. We had a few bottles of oxygen on board, but never used them within a 24-hour period so as to save them for real emergencies, and the same was true of our potash containers, which filtered out carbon dioxide. Although we were not supposed to have a level of carbon dioxide higher than 2.5%, we lived regularly with double that amount, and none of us seemed to suffer any permanent damage as a result. After 24 hours, however, lack of fresh air made itself noticeable with heavier breathing and more sluggish activities. For this reason, the use of the schnorchel was welcomed on board, and when we employed it, we arranged our ventilation system so that incoming fresh air was channeled first to the bow compartment, from where the diesel sucked it, without any use of pipes, back through all the forward compartments, and then into the engine room in the aft part of the boat. By this method, all the crew except those aft of the engine room got an immediate whiff of what was to us the most sweet-smelling air. On the last day of March of 1945, we began to operate completely underwater, and the surviving records of the patrol show that we only surfaced 3 times in the next 40 days. Finally, early in April, we entered our operational area off Halifax. I clearly remember that the temperatures near the coast were much colder. In U-190, the temperature outside the engine room rarely crept above 40 degrees and often sank to only 34 degrees Fahrenheit. But we regarded this as only a minor inconvenience because we knew it was worse on the surface. Close inshore, we navigated by using our echolot depth finder or by taking advantage of the convenient navigation points provided by the Zamro lightship and the lights of Halifax. That city had no blackout, and although we could not see its lights from the open sea, we knew exactly where it was because the glow was clearly visible on the western horizon. We did not sight any convoys, only single merchant vessels, and these were usually small coastal vessels not worth wasting one of our 14 torpedoes on. As the chief engineer, I wasn't too involved in tactical matters, but it appeared that all commercial traffic in the area had come to a halt. On the other hand, the Royal Canadian Navy must have suspected that we were in the area because they seemed to carry out constant ASTIC searches for us. Occasionally, depth charges were dropped on our supposed location, which was fortunately far away from our true location. Few came close enough to cause more than minimal damage, and even fewer presented any real danger. A more disconcerting effect on our nerves was created by the noise of the cat gear streamed or towed by surface warship for protection against our acoustic torpedoes. It consisted of two iron bars that, when dragged through the water behind a warship, produced a rattle far louder than the vessel's propellers and therefore served as an effective decoy to divert our T5 acoustic torpedoes from their intended target. Long before an enemy warship could be seen or heard by our listening gear, the noise of cat gear alerted us to the presence of the enemy because it sounded in our submerged boat like a Kreissäge or an ear-piercing circular saw, and that was the name we gave that contraption. For years after the war was over, a noise as innocent as the humming of a bee would instantly bring back unwelcome memories of that devilish device. Anytime the situation became too uncomfortable, we crept close inshore and spent some time on the bottom. Here we felt relatively safe because the very poor ASTIC conditions in this area and the many wrecks made it difficult for the enemy to find us. We also knew that prevailing wisdom in the Allied navies held that a U-boat would seek deep water for safety, and they therefore looked for us farther out to sea, and by hiding in the shallows, we were able to thwart them. We, of course, did not know it at this time, but the depredations of Allied shipping made the previous December and January by U-806 and U-1232 had resulted in the major eastbound convoy assembly points being switched from Halifax to Portland, Maine, and Boston, Massachusetts, and this was the reason for the scarcity of targets in our patrol area. On April 12, 1945, we received our last distinct message from High Command in Germany. After that, we heard nothing more from Goliath, which had been overrun by Allied troops, and from here on, we were on our own. That same day, or the next, as the war diary for this patrol did not survive the war, and one day submerged off Halifax was much like any other, Oberleutnant Reit fired a total of 4 torpedoes at a freighter and a steamer, which he claimed to have spotted by periscope. He did not witness the destruction of these vessels, but later stated that he had heard the torpedoes exploding and was certain he had hit both. We did not wait around, however, to find out whether we were successful, but immediately went to the bottom, which was quite shallow in this area, to hide from the inevitable anti-submarine sweep, which we were sure would follow. Nothing happened, however, and we continued our patrol. On April the 16th, we had just finished our midday meal, early morning local time, in the wardroom when we heard the pinging of ASTIC against our hull. Reit went to periscope depth and, raising the device, spotted a small warship rapidly approaching from astern. Convinced we had been discovered, he decided to defend the boat by firing a T5 acoustic torpedo from a stern tube. A short period later, we heard an explosion followed by Sinkgeräusche, the noises made by a sinking ship as its bulkheads collapsed. We had not been able to identify our target, nor did we loiter around to investigate what was clearly a victory for U-190, but moved away and hit on the bottom. Strangely enough, there was no immediate reaction on the part of the enemy to this attack, although it was clear that we had sunk an Allied warship. Much later I learned that our victim was HMCS Esquimalt, a Bangor-class minesweeper carrying out an anti-submarine patrol in the approaches to Halifax Harbor. Post-war research indicates that, despite standing orders, Esquimalt's captain was neither zigzagging nor towing the cat gear with which his ship was equipped. He had also switched his radar off, and although his ASTIC operators were searching for possible contacts, it is not clear whether they had actually detected U-190 before Reit fired. Our torpedo hit Eskimol's starboard side and she sank in less than 4 minutes, giving her radio operator no opportunity to send a distress call to alert other ships that she was sinking and that there was a U-boat in the area. Eskimol went down so fast that her crew had no time to launch her whaler and managed to get only 4 of the vessel's 6 Kali floats into the water. Most of them, however, were able to leave the doomed vessel and swim on the floats, but their ordeal was by no means over. No other Canadian warships or shore establishments knew that Eskimol had been sunk, and the survivors, not warmly dressed, were forced to spend 6 hours on the North Atlantic while aircraft flew overhead and ships steamed by at a distance, ignoring their desperate attempts to summon help. By the time they were rescued, many had tragically succumbed to hypothermia and exhaustion, and in the end, of the 70 officers and sailors in the Minesweeper's crew, 44 lost their lives. HMCS Eskimol was the last Canadian warship to be sunk during the Second World War. At the time, of course, we knew nothing of the consequences of our actions. This was typical of the Submariners' War, as rarely did we become aware of the human suffering we caused. During the entire war, I did not see a single dead person, nor any blood. In the end, we believed we would either come home happy and healthy, or we would not come back. There was nothing in between. Within the next 10 hours, however, we became fully aware that the enemy, now alerted to our presence, was hunting for us. American and Canadian warships began a sweep around the approaches to Halifax and continued this activity for several days. Over the next week, they were reinforced by more vessels, but the enemy, convinced that we would seek deep water, hunted farther out to sea, while during most of this time we were close inshore and on the bottom. We thus escaped retribution from the enemy, but 3 days after the sinking of Eskimol, we nearly sunk ourselves. On April the 19th, just after having terminated our nightly use of the Schnorchel, I had gone into the wardroom to eat, leaving the completion of the operation to my engineer in training, Ernst Glink. I suddenly felt the boat going down rapidly by the stern, and my plate slid off the table. I raced to the Zentrale and found to my horror that the Schnorchel had been lowered into its horizontal storage position without the huge valve in the connecting pipe outside the conning tower first being closed. As a result, tons of water had flooded the engine room and short-circuited our main switchboards, producing flames and smoke. There was absolutely no alternative but to blow the tanks and surface. So there we were, sitting ducks on a brightly moonlit night inside of the Zambro lightship at the mouth of Halifax Harbour and quite unable to move. We immediately set about the task of pumping out the water and getting our electrical system back into shape, a process that required nearly 2 hours' work. The crew's nerves were very much on edge, and Oberleutnant Reit on the bridge naturally became impatient, several times urging me to hurry up with the repairs. I refused, however, to be hurried because I wanted to be absolutely sure that the boat was safe before taking it down again. Finally, I decided it was safe enough to dive, and we submerged only to face more hours of work cleaning up the mess in the engine rooms. Today, I find it hard to believe that we could spend that much time on the surface near one of the busiest ports in the world and not be discovered. By the last days of April of 1945, having prowled off Halifax Harbour for a period of nearly 3 weeks, our fuel and food began to run low, and Reit contemplated a return to Norway. On April the 29th, we therefore turned east and commenced the long journey home, but on the following day Reit claimed to have spotted a frigate or destroyer and fired 3 torpedoes at this vessel, all of which apparently missed. At this time, I should mention that although we were not receiving radio transmissions from High Command, we did occasionally get scraps of information from North American radio broadcasts, and the news was not good. The Russians were fighting in the streets of Berlin and close to my parents' home in Blankenfelde, while the American, British and Canadian armies had penetrated deep inside Western Germany. To lift our sagging spirits, we decided to stage a rather unmilitary interlude. The 1st of May was Germany's national holiday, our equivalent to America's 4th of July or the Canadian Dominion Day. We knew that, no matter what the future held in store for us, May the 1st, 1945 might be the last opportunity we would have for some time to celebrate the occasion in style, and we decided to do so. In normal times, U-boat crew members received a generous monthly ration of alcohol in the form of several bottles of liquor. These bottles were usually left at the base to be taken to our homes after we returned from a patrol, but when we left Kiel in February of 1945, we were not altogether certain that we would be coming back to that particular port, and to prevent those desirable items from falling into the wrong hands, we had taken them along on our patrol, just as we had our dress uniforms. As the outlook for future parties to enjoy this liquid cargo appeared rather poor, we decided to live up to our responsibilities and have a rousing national holiday party right then and there at a depth of 200 feet somewhere between Halifax and southern Newfoundland. Despite the fact that the war was still being fought, we paid little attention to other happenings in the world and even hoped that Allied seamen were also having a holiday. In U-190 from stem to stern, the party got noisier and noisier and ever more boisterous. I had delegated responsibility for keeping proper depth to the forward plainsman, who at the time happened to be our number one, Bootsmart Alois Feldbauer. As the party progressed, I went to check on him and asked him how it was going. He replied with great satisfaction, "Boat holds steady, Herr Oberleutnant," tapping the depth gauge, which was indeed not moving at all. Unfortunately, it was not the depth gauge, but the clock. One of our youngest sailors, who had not had enough training in the naval art of holding one's liquor without becoming sick, became very sick indeed. He climbed into the conning tower above the Zentrale and made quite a mess. When he had recovered somewhat, he was ordered to take a pair of seawater into the tower and clean up, an order he did not seem to find unreasonable. Staggering up the ladder with his pail, he had almost reached the conning tower when he lost his grip on the pail and it came crashing down, unfortunately at exactly the same moment as the CO was passing underneath. Wright, thoroughly drenched, was not at all amused. Our CO was rather a pompous man and not well liked by his officers, who were almost inclined to award the hapless sailor a medal. Or by the ordinary crew members who detested his habit of twisting their ears or pulling their hair to enforce his authority. On his orders, a pro forma court-martial was immediately convened, which was hampered by the fact that no sober participants could be found. The culprit, having a very bad conscience, was eager to do penance and stammered to the CO, "Herr Oberleutnant, I deserve punishment and I think that you should shoot me with a torpedo. There are enough left over." This response drew suppressed laughter from the court, but by the time we found a solution to the problem, we had all sobered up again and the incident was mercifully forgotten. The chuckles, however, went round the boat for days afterwards. When we had recovered, we continued on our way home. We were still fighting the war because we did not know it had ended on May the 2nd when the German armed forces surrendered to the Allies. Indeed, Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery the day before our party under the sea. On May the 8th, 1945, while we headed northeast towards Norway, Germany formally signed the surrender documents and the Second World War came to an official end.
And there we go. U-190 has survived the war against all odds and our author made it through as well. But the story doesn't end here. But firstly, I have to apologize again. I'm still recording the after-action reports inside of a hotel room, so there might be a slight echo. Anyway, those of you with keen eyes will have noticed that U-190 in the thumbnail and other images is actually flying the Canadian naval ensign. She did for some time. How it came to this and how it all went down, we shall find out in the next episode. Cheers.